It's my pleasure to now introduce today's panel conversation, A View with Industry on the State of Shipbuilding. This panel will explore the current state of U.S. shipbuilding as the industry faces growing challenges. However, despite difficulties in commercial shipbuilding, the U.S. shipbuilding sector remains vital for national defense. Key topics in today's discussion will include aging shipyards, a shrinking workforce, and complex regulations that drive up production costs. To moderate this important conversation is Bryan, a retired Navy submariner and senior fellow and director for the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. Bryan specializes in naval operations, electronic warfare, autonomous systems, and military strategy. Prior to joining the Hudson Institute, he was a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where he led studies for the Department of Defense on emerging technologies and future warfare. Mr. Clark served previously as Special Assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, where he contributed to strategy development and key initiatives in undersea warfare, electromagnetic spectrum operations, and personnel management. Please join me in welcoming Bryan Clark as our panel moderator this morning.
All right, well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you all for being here and sticking around for the afternoon entertainment, or I guess the end of the day entertainment. I'm joined here on the stage by three leaders in the shipbuilding industry to talk about where we are with shipbuilding in the Navy, the challenges we face, the opportunities, and some of the ways forward to be able to build that future hybrid fleet that we keep hearing about. So with me are Eric Chewning, who is currently with the Huntington Ingalls Industries, or HII, where he's the Executive Vice President. Previous to this, he's been the Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, as well as being Deputy Assistant Secretary for Industrial Policy. Also with us is Eric Snider, who is Vice President for the Columbia program over at General Dynamics Electric Boat, where he has been for a number of years, where he previously ran the Applied Physical Sciences Division as Chief Engineer, and also was at Naval Reactors for 34 years. But he's a pretty good guy, despite all the time at Naval Reactors. And then on the very end there, Mark Vandroff, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Fincantieri Marinette Marine up in Wisconsin. And before his time at Fincantieri Marinette Marine, he was Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy on the National Security Council staff. And was also in the Navy, the Major Program Manager for the Arleigh Burke destroyers and Commanding Officer of Navy Surface Warfare Center at Carter Rock. We're not too far from here. So gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
To just kind of set the context, I think we all kind of know what's going on with Navy shipbuilding today. Many ship classes are late in being delivered, according to at least the timelines the Navy has set out. Particularly, frigate program's been challenged, Virginia class has been challenged, but there's challenges across the board in terms of Navy shipbuilding programs. The Navy hasn't made a lot of progress towards the hybrid fleet that we've been talking about, both in and out of the Navy for several years now. We haven't really made that pivot to start incorporating more uncrewed systems into the fleet. We haven't really rebalanced the fleet towards the larger numbers of smaller ships that we keep aspiring toward, so we can talk about why that hasn't happened. Some programs are working through some design issues. We've got some delays, both driven by the Navy, maybe some are driven by the industrial base. And then, unlike our foreign counterparts, we don't have a commercial shipbuilding industry we can tap into to gain capacity or expertise or to be able to amortize capital investments across. So the lack of a commercial shipbuilding industry in the U.S. is an impact that the U.S. Navy is unable to take advantage of. And then the last thing is we do have allied countries or companies in allied countries that want to help and have expressed a lot of interest in joining the U.S. shipbuilding industrial base. Some have made investments, some have merely made aspirations towards making those investments, but we can talk a little bit about how foreign and allied shipbuilders may be able to contribute to improving U.S. shipbuilding outcomes. So those are some of the things we'll want to talk about today, and I think I want to start off with kind of just the big picture challenge, which is we're unable to get most of our ship classes out on time, at least in the time frame that we wanted to. What do you see as some of the major factors there, and what are some of the ways you're trying to work through the kind of fundamental challenge of getting ships out on time? So Eric, I'll start with you.
Sure, happy to. First of all, it's great to be up here with Mark and Eric and Bryan, thank you. Listen, there's a confluence of issues that we need to address. We've got to grow and retain a world-class workforce. We have to invest in new technologies to drive deck plate performance. We have to modernize our infrastructure and expand shipyard capacity, and we have to rebuild our supply chain. I think the biggest gating issue we're finding right now in our ability to do all of those things is that we're operating underneath an environment where the vast majority of our contracts were set with pre-COVID economics, right? So when you think about that, our cost structure was locked in with assumptions from about 2019. And so we need the flexibility and the headroom to make investments, to increase wages, to expand in the shipyards, to increase in those process technologies, to take advantage of the digital revolution. But to do that, we need mechanisms like SAWs, which enable us to create headroom on the contracting vehicles where we can reinvest to do expansion of the workforce, expansion of shipyard capacity, expansion of process technologies. Yep. Not having something like SAWs in place is the biggest single gating issue for our ability to get ships out on time.
Because you're always behind in terms of your investment.
Behind, and you need the investment headroom to get out in front of those things.
Eric?
Well, thank you to the Naval Institute for having us here. Proud to be here with fellow shipbuilders. And I would address also that specifically the workforce and building the workforce that we need to be able to deliver the ships like we expected to when we entered into those contracting schemes from the pre-COVID years is where we need to be. We spent across my career, we spent the better part of the last 3 decades as an enterprise shrinking. And because of peace dividend, whatever you want to call it, we spent 3 decades shrinking the entirety of the enterprise. And now we've thought about the fact that we need to grow, and we have taken some actions together as an enterprise to try to grow. But I'd say I don't think we've really faced into the enormity of the hole that we dug for ourselves over 3 decades. And so this is, I worry sometimes whenever we talk about workforce being an issue that can quickly get translated to the people. I want to be clear, 100% crystal clear, that the people we have coming into the shipyards these days are top-notch people who, and we can talk a little bit more later about the things that we're doing to make them ready to be in the shipyard. When they arrive in the shipyard, the time between arriving and actually doing productive work, we're shrinking that time. We're reaching as far as into the elementary schools to try to capture the minds of folks that shipbuilding is a noble craft to come and to go do. And I think the biggest thing about all of that is as leaders, we also have participated in that shrinking of the enterprise for the last 3 decades. And it's going to take leadership and new leadership, not new leadership ideas, new leading ideas about how to lead that workforce to produce what we're going to need them to produce. And certainly SAWs is a big piece of that.
Right. Yeah, Mark?
So let me try and add something new and different to the conversation, even though I would say pretty much if you had asked me first, I would have hit on a lot of the themes that the 2 Erics here have hit on. I see a lot of former surface and current surface warfare officers out in the audience. And whenever I explain shipbuilding now to a SWO, and I think this would work for the rest of the warfare communities within the Navy, I talk about the detect to engage sequence, because the SWO understands, hey, if I want to destroy a target, I have to go through an entire detect to engage sequence. A missile doesn't just slam into an enemy aircraft without a lot of steps. Shipbuilding, the missile slamming into the point of contact, where the analogy of the missile slamming into the enemy aircraft is that welder doing a weld, it's that electrician pulling a cable. But there is a detect to engage sequence behind that starts with design and various types of design, a functional design leading into a detailed design and a computer model, leading into a planning package, leading into a shipyard planning process that ends up producing work that an actual shipyard worker can do. we're very focused, and rightly so, about the bang at the end because we need more people at the bang. But we really need more and better talent, resources, processes throughout that entire detect to engage. So, right now, a lot of people were talking about the lead program in my yard, the frigate, which is a hot topic. One of the things we found is not only, do I need more people for, just like all my colleagues here building the ship, but the intellectual database on both the industry and government side to produce and check and approve that design. The bench there, because of 30 years of downsizing, is equally thin in places, and that becomes its own bottleneck so that you don't produce the functional design to the detailed design to the planning packages to even get in the hands of the workers that you don't have enough of in the beginning, right, to start with. But that all of that is thin, and that if we're going to be a nation that consistently produces new and innovative designs for maritime platforms, you got to look at the entire picture there. So not just who are you getting into welding and electrician trades, which are critical, but who are you getting into schools of naval architecture and marine engineering, and are you investing in the right design tools? Are you investing in the right, in order to create that entire detect to engage process that ends with someone actually building part of a ship?
It's a great point, Mark. So to pull the string on that a little bit for all of you, it seems like we've had this shift towards digitization in other warfare areas where we do a lot of digital design and we do the whole engineering process digitally, and there's a lot of virtualization of that and virtual machines, and that allows us to speed up the manufacturing process because it allows you to get visibility into the supply chain and orchestrate that whole detect to engage sequence digitally. Are we able to do that on the shipbuilding side to make that process more efficient, to get from the point of all the way back to the manufacturer of the equipment and the parts you're going to need, and start making sure that things are sequenced in the right way so that the ship can get built as fast as possible? Are we able to do that? So you can start with Mark. Yeah.
Sure. So I would say I'm pretty pleased with the tools that we have right now. One of the advantages for us being part, since Fincantieri Marinette Marine is a shipyard that's owned by a large global shipbuilding company that builds ships in Europe and Asia and South America. So we really benefit in a lot of cases from seeing what our colleagues around the world do and get improvement from that source of improvement. We have modern, sophisticated design tools for ships. So you have most everyone now is using Ship Constructor of some form around the world. It's become an industry standard. But Fincantieri has layered on its own proprietary tools on top of that that lets us do really good visualization, when really good understanding, really good tagging of all the different parts of all that. Getting that down through our supply chain so that our supply chain supports us in that, especially an American supply chain, that's the next level of sophistication that we need to reach down to.
Yeah. Eric, what about an electric boat?
Well, electric boat, we went into full-on digital design, first ever submarine design for modular construction with the Virginia class. And that tool from the early 90s served us well all the way up through 2009, 2010, and it is still serving us for the construction of the Virginia class submarines today. But for the Columbia class, we introduced a new tool through Team Center that has been a really powerful tool for us. It does require a lot of specific modifications for our applications, and we have struggled with the translation of the digital. We got the digital engineering design really good. The part that we're struggling the most with is the translation down into the welder striking an arc on the deck plate, and so that's it's not because of the tool. It's just because of our application and our ability to do that translation. Who's doing that translation? There's, as with everything, as Eric said at the beginning, there's a whole range of factors that come into that. There's not in any of these. There's not just one thing that you can put your finger on and say, go fix that thing. and everything will be better. But we're very well pleased with the tool that we have and the tools that we're going to and we're going to continue to use that tool going forward.
Right. Yeah, I mean, listen, Industry 4.0 technologies have to be part of the solution to get us out of where we are, right? And so if we were to take this room, put you down on new carrier construction right now, you would see folks with the 3D model, on the deck plate using that for drawings, right? And Eric talked about work that's being done in Columbia. So I think that's part of the solution. I would say where we are relative to other industries, whether it's auto or commercial aerospace, is we're relatively nascent. And I think there's goodness there in that there's a lot of room to grow and advance, right? So a lot of headroom for us, particularly as you begin to think about the role of additive manufacturing and addressing bottlenecks we have in our supply chain. All that said, to fully leverage the benefits of these new technologies, you need investment and you need headroom in the contracts to go ahead and make those investments so we can begin to get those process efficiencies in place to accelerate production. And you need to be able to pay your workforce and the type of workforce that you want to retrain. We're all proud of our shipbuilders. They're great men and women, right? But you need to be able to train them in these new digital technologies.
So for that investment, I mean, I know that, actually I know all three of your shipyards have made your own investments in infrastructure and technology improvements. So it's not a matter of you're looking for a handout, I think, from the government to do this. But to what degree does the government, does the Navy need to make some of these investments independent of what might be allotted for in a particular contract?
So I think there's a couple ways to think about it. So one is, over half of our capital allocation that we do when you think about stakeholder investments in either share purchases or dividend payments or capital in the shipyard, over half of it is in capital in the shipyard, right? So, and that's higher for shipbuilding than it is to other defense verticals within the defense ecosystem. So we're investing a lot of money in this right now ourselves. MID projects are funded to help accelerate these efforts as well. I think to Eric's earlier point, we have dramatically as a country underestimated the investment necessary to dig ourselves out of the hole we put ourselves in when we allowed the industry to consolidate the way it did in 1993, 1994, right? And so now we are trying to build our way out of that, literally and figuratively, through a series of investments, and it's going to take sustained investment to undo choices that were made over the past 30 years.
Right. So the Navy's got efforts underway to help the nuclear and particularly the submarine industrial base, so the Blue Forge Alliance, then this you're using consulting firms like Deloitte to divide money up among the submarine industrial base. Mark, should we be making those kinds of investments in other parts of the shipbuilding industrial base as well?
So that's a leading question. Because as the surface ship guy here, I'm gonna jump up and down and say yes. I will say over the last couple of years, Congress has been very helpful. They've added industrial base funding for the frigate program, and we have made what I believe is good use of that, especially in some of the initiatives we've done with our workforce. So we can't, statutorily, we can't just use that money to say, here's a higher salary. But we have used it for training and retention efforts. So one of the things I was really pleased to announce yesterday to my workforce is starting in 2025, we're going to be providing $5,000 a year child tax credit for daycare expenses for any employee who has daycare expenses, goes through a process, and we'll be able to subsidize tax-free to them up to $5,000. And the Navy has helped us sharing the ability to get to that. A couple of other things where recently we've looked and talked about automation and enabling our workforce to be more effective. For our painters and for our welders, we've looked at exoskeletons both produced here and produced in Europe. We've done comparisons with what our sister yards in Fincantieri in Italy are doing. And then the Navy has partnered with us to make some investments in those exoskeletons so that we will make each worker more efficient. They'll be able to bear weight more easily while they're working overhead. And so that's just another example of, one, having the worldwide reach to be able to see what's out there in the market potentially, and then working with the Navy to realize the investment. And that's something that Congress has provided over a couple of years. We hope to be able to do more of that in the future. But as Eric was saying, support for the workforce in general is certainly will be a key component of having a suitably sized, suitably retained workforce. But like I said, some of those have already started to go. And I would just say, on the subject of talking about investment, I'd be amiss if I hadn't talked about what our parent company has invested in Wisconsin. We've built new buildings where I can build 2 entire frigates under cover, really big building, but I can build them all within a building. Ships start as panels, and we now have a panel line that, if you had been at my company 4 or 5 years ago, our panel line would have been, this, rolling line with about 24 to 30 welders and interior cranes and people doing flipping of panels by hand. And we looked at what the cruise ship yards were doing over in Italy, and now my panel line is about 16 robots, a couple of welders and a couple of operators on a brand new panel line producing the frigate panels. And then we invested in, we went beyond having a graving dock or having a floating dock, but for the frigate now we actually have a modern synchro ship lift, and that lift capability, I can get 10,000 tons worth of ship in and out of the water without I'll call it the hassle of a floating dry dock, which when you own a floating dry dock, you're basically, as a shipyard, deciding to take care of a ship yourself, right? Because that floating dry dock is as much of a maintenance. And the modern ship lifts that you see down in Australia, over in Europe, now we've brought that capability to the United States.
So, you've all made investments in your shipyards, and then the Navy's making other investments in the shipbuilding industrial base. NAVSEA's not here, so we can pick on them. Do you get the impression that there's an effort to try to orchestrate or to figure out which investments are the most valuable in terms of advancing ship production? Because it comes across as a little bit ad hoc. Like we've got Blue Forge Alliance, and we've got Deloitte throwing money around the industrial base. We've got the shipbuilders making their own investments. Do you get a sense that there's an effort to coordinate or to at least prioritize where the investment dollars are most effectively spent, or are we kind of all entrepreneurial in how we're doing this?
Let me take that and let me address it in 2 parts. So part 1 is, I can tell you for a fact, we have a model, my team runs it, right? Where we look across capital investments for both our shipyards, and we understand which investment from outside funding would give us the highest return from a throughput perspective. So I feel very comfortable about kind of our analytical underpinning from that. You broaden the aperture. So in the Trump administration, I led the 13806 report, which was the most comprehensive review of the defense industrial base since the Eisenhower administration. And what you found was true across defense verticals, right? There was a lack of multi-tier supply chain visibility, right, in every defense vertical.
Right.
And then once you got into the 2nd or 3rd tier of the supply chain, it became very clear that a critical supplier was probably sole sourced to 5 separate programs under different primes, right? And so I think to the spirit of your question, both DoD and the shipbuilders are owners of the ecosystem that underpins the industrial base. And so as we make investments, it's appropriate for other stakeholders to look in the sub-tier to make investments that open the aperture across the board. They just need to be coordinated, right? And we've got mechanisms in place to make sure that coordination occurs.
Yeah.
And since you mentioned NAVSEA, I don't know if anyone from NAVSEA is here, but I'll pile on. You talk about the ecosystem, alumni. Good to see you, Admiral, but the alumni. One of the things I've learned working now for Fincantieri is to what extent we drive our own singularities into our defense industrial base down there. We have, and I'll just use it because it's kind of top of my mind. And everyone here uses this, right? For a lot of the high voltage cable that goes on ships and submarines, there is a NATO standard for that is different from the American standard. If we use the NATO standard, there's several European companies we could buy cable from. With the American standard, you've taken everyone else out of the market because our standard is just enough different that it's not worth those international cable suppliers. And I use that only not to pick on the cable, and God forbid, not to pick on the American makers of cable, it's a wonderful company. But it's an example of where one set of specifications drives, then that's the one guy who can make it.
Right.
And it's not just cable. You could point to many different component systems, commodities within shipbuilding where our standards, right, wrong, or indifferent, are different than everybody else's standards in the world.
Right.
And if we want them to stay different, then everyone should realize with clear eyes that we are paying premium for that. If we want them to change, then we should do that with clear eye and understand what might we be giving up in some area of performance. But right now, in many cases, my sense is we do it because we've always done it that way and we think we can, and those are our standards and we love them.
Right.
And I say that, you mentioned I'm the former commanding officer of Carderock, so I had a command whose job it was to come up with those standards and validate those standards. And I always, when I was CEO of Carderock, believed that they were serving us well, and I think they generally serve us well, but that's also an area that's worth a scrub of, would flexibility there help us broaden out that base and therefore reduce those cycle times?
I think that it's not it may sound contrary, but it won't be. It's not. I don't mean it to be contrary. For submarines, for standards were standards grew out of learning across the not just World War II, but the loss of the Thresher and the loss of the Scorpion as well. And I believe that the standards that we have are good standards. I believe that those standards were created and used across the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe a little bit into the 90s by folks who wrote them and understood what they meant and understood why they said what they said. And I think that as we talked about everybody else shrinking, I'm not picking on the Navy. This thing about experience at the cold face, whatever your piece of the cold face is, it goes everywhere. And so I think not a fault of their own, but the folks that are that are enforcing those standards these days don't have the benefit of understanding everything about why they are the way they are. And I think it's not an Achilles heel at all, but I think it's something that we need to work on, trying to figure out how to employ the standards, at least for submarines. How do we employ the standards that we have and understand the basis for them, while also being always open to new ideas and to be able to learn from others. But it's the criticality for me. And I think I did 6 sea trials, alpha sea trials, first dive to test depth and that sort of thing. And the underpinning of all of that is critical to the continued success.
Yeah, the father of Aegis, Wayne E. Meyer, once told me, this was after he had retired, but I was working at NAVSEA and he gave me some fatherly advice. He said, you can always take down a fence as long as you know why you put it up to begin with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe just to build on that point, I think what's interesting now is how do these standards apply as we think about new technologies, right? So talk about additive, right? We have a lot of standards that are addressed for existing process technologies. Then you get into something like 3D printing. And you say, okay, well, how do I apply that existing standard to a new process technology? And how quickly am I driving adoption of that new process technology to address the fact that, to Mark's point, I only have one supplier who does this thing because the business case for the industry structure is for only one person to do that. Right. But if I can do additive, then I can do that in the shipyard, right, to help expand the supply base. And I think that's an interesting conversation around how we think about the role of releasing technology standards for new processes and looking at that trade-off as it drives throughput enhancement.
If I could just catch up for a second, Brian, on the investment. The investment from the Navy, the Congress, and from all of our corporations is dreadfully needed. We've put General Dynamics has put over $5 billion into facilities, workforce, equipment, and all of that sort of thing to be able to underpin at least the beginning of the growth that we're seeing. And while those investments are so critically needed, I think the ability to look into the industrial base, and we have teams of people that work on a daily basis looking into all, first tier, sub tiers, all of that, to figure out where are their weak points, and trying to figure out what investments can and should we do to be able to underpin them. While that's important, I like to say I'm a card carrying capitalist, and I kind of feel like breaking the paradigm of how many ship sets of material, for example, that we can buy is something that is a challenge that we all ought to get behind. For instance, for the Columbia class specifically, I know we're going to buy at least 12 copies of that submarine. Yet I can only buy the next 5 years worth of material, and so I know folks don't want to commit future administrations and Congresses to this thing, but are they really going to turn up and say we're not going to do these ships? Right. So I think there's some opportunity in paradigm thinking around investments and how the investments get made.
Yeah, it seems like there could be better coordination between the different parties that are making these investments in the industrial base and in the shipyards themselves, right? Because I think that it just seems from the outside like there's a lot of money moving, and it's not necessarily being organized in a coherent way across all the players.
And the quickest way to see return on investment, which is the other thing that we constantly get questioned, well, we've put in all this money, when am I going to see the return on investment? We're working on the front end of this whole value stream, and it's going to take time. It's appropriate and proper to invest in the beginning of it, but it's going to take time for that to work its way through the snake.
And I'd say, Bryan, I wouldn't call it uncoordinated. I think it is coordinated. I think it's a federated approach, right? So you've got multiple actors participating, but I think that is our model. We have a federated approach for how we address these kind of problems. But I do think there's good coordination. And I think the investments that Congress and the Navy have made have been important. The investments the shipyard's making is important. And I think ultimately it really needs to be about how do we uplift the ecosystem as a whole. Right. And that requires sort of the team effort, right? Yeah. And I think we're on the early part of that now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to follow up on one of the things that you brought up, Mark, the idea of standards and the role of technical warrant holders and all of that in driving the design of ships. Obviously, this has been a challenge with the frigate, is adapting to the standards that were being used in the U.S. Navy. So there are processes for adopting new standards, but it seems like those are probably not adequately resourced. The process by which we would analyze a new standard to assess its utility. Do we need to think about putting money into that process to try to revise standards that were designed around analog
sides.
Analysis?
Yeah, both sides, and then I'll use another one of my favorite examples from the frigate program, and so you make a ship out of steel. Steel just sitting there it's kind of floppy when you make it in something, so you have to stiffen it. And if you went to any other surface ship in any other Navy, you would see that the steel in a panel is generally going to be stiffened with a single line of steel that comes out into a bulb and might be flat on one side and goes by the name a bulb flat. In the U.S. Navy, that piece of steel has another piece of steel in a T-type shape and is known as a structural T. And that seems really trivial, but over the course of something the size of a destroyer or frigate, you're talking about dozens of tons of weight of steel, of extra weight of steel, and the T is much harder to fabricate and weld in, so you're adding both cost and labor hours. And if you went to my former colleagues at Carderock, they would show you all the data on blast resistance and wave resistance, and they would show the difference, and they would say the T is better.
Right.
And so that's where we get our standards from. Right. As we're looking and we want a bigger fleet, we want to expand all that, I would want the Navy corporately, one, to make sure that it's got an adequate technical base, right? And as everything shrunk, the Navy's technical base has shrunk, so that if someone comes up with well, I've got a compromise. Why don't we do some T's and some other stuff and then look at that, and is that going to actually be good enough? The Navy is intellectually open to that, But from a being resourced to consider it at the fullness that the way the Navy wants to consider any time they make a technical change, that ends up being a pretty slow process.
Right.
And then from a value stream, and I've got friends who would argue that in the age of hypersonic missiles, the differential of quality that something like that gives you may or may not be, the juice may not be worth the squeeze. And again, I'm taking one little example.
Yeah.
You could go through the entire, the build spec of a frigate is about 2,000 pages. So I could go through all 2,000 pages of those specifications and say, is this really what we want to do? And if the answer is yes, then God bless America, industry will go do that.
Right.
I just think that needs to be, I think that decision needs to be a little bit more mindful, right, or a little bit more realized, as we go forward. Not just from the programs that I'm involved with, but I'm talking about in general. Eric Labs, who might still be here, okay, talked about that he would like to have seen an LUSV that is optionally mannable, right? So that would be great because then you'd be flexible, all that. And when he said that, all the blood drained out of my, and I just was ready to fall. The advantage of putting a U in front of something is I end the debate on how much of that survivability and all those standards is necessary, right? If you're going to tell me that, okay, everything we do for test depth, because I'm going to put 100, 110 of America's finest sailors on a submarine, I'm going to take it below. We can't take risk, right? When other navies take risk, they end up with crunched submarines. We're going to know perfectly so that when they go to test depth, we know they're coming back. I'm there for you. When the coal happens, when something like the coal happens and a ship takes a blast nearby in port, right? That ship doesn't sink. It stays floating. It stays floating because they were stiffened with T's and not bulb flats. I'm with you on that. If you tell me you want something optionally manned, then I'm going to take all of those things that should be getting cost out of our unmanned platforms and should be making our unmanned platforms much easier to build, because now I don't care about that. I don't have any precious sailors there. I'm just trying to get something out in mass with capability, and if it gets itself blown up, I'll make another, right? But if you make it optionally manned, I can only build it one way, and do I optionally put all of that goodness that we do because it's carrying our precious sailors there? I'm now done with my rant. But that was when Eric said that, I said, because I've heard that before, and it's like, I don't think people always appreciate how much of the cost and craft and time of the ships we build go in making it suitable for our sailors to be on them, which is one of the great promises of going to unmanned systems. It's not just that there won't be people on it, and it's because you can take so much cost out of it because now I don't have to worry about all those things we do to make it safe for our sailors and survivable for the sailors that we put on those platforms.
So Mark, a great rant, by the way. But
Rant done.
So the question that raises, though, is that if we want things to be fully uncrewed, they probably can't be as large as the LUSV was intended to be. So we shift to a set of smaller systems.
Maybe not. You could uncrew something that size and just pack. You increase your mission capability, right? It's more missiles. It's more sensors.
You got to get in and out of port, though. I mean, so you might have to figure out a way to handle that. But but it becomes expensive, right? It turns into a relatively big, expensive thing, and then at what point do you say, well, is it worth not having people on here if it's going to be a $400 million ship that is now going to be more or less like a combatant? So if we see going to smaller uncrewed systems as the way to go in terms of building out the hybrid fleet, is that something we need to have a whole new class of shipbuilders to produce if we're going to do it at the kinds of scale that the Navy aspires to do? Or is that something we try to feather into our existing shipbuilding industrial base here in the U.S.? Eric, you guys do both this.
So we're obviously America's largest military shipyard. We also are the largest producer of UUV capability, right? So you do both. I think to answer that question, you have to first answer the question that says, well, what's the role of unmanned capability in my force structure?
Yeah.
And how big is it going to be? Because do I need an industry that's going to be scaled to support 200 ships, or an industry that's going to be scaled to support 5? You know what I mean? And that I think drives the question. It says it doesn't need to be specialized, or does it not to be specialized? Could you make an argument that says if we are going to have 100, then that'll naturally lead to the evolution of a specialized shipyard because, as Mark pointed out, I don't need all of the requirements that I need for a manned shipyard, which means I can do it more efficiently and I'll economize myself to do it? I think yes, but you need that demand signal in place first.
Right.
And until you have that demand signal, you're not going to know the answer to the question because the industry won't know how to organize.
Right.
And I think you need that demand signal. You need to figure out how industry should organize. And I do think we don't want to. You start with a clean sheet of paper, but I think you need to bring folks along who are familiar with how we got. Still familiar with how we got to where we are. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a 60-year-old guy about to phase out. That's not. But I do think you need to bring that knowledge along to the new part.
And what I'll say about the first, when it comes to, if you're going to change that fleet force structure and do you need different yards, to a certain extent, to quote Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come, right? The industry will shape itself to the new demand signal. But one of the things in my experience when I got the privilege of serving at the National Security Council, and I got to see more of the DoD than just the Navy that I was very familiar with, and I saw more of what the other services contribute, what their challenges and capabilities were. I came away with the philosophy of what I call wide and deep, right? What do you need to solve a given problem? And the answer is yes. In the chaos of the world, you will never know exactly what itch you need to scratch. So the future, you need manned platforms, you need unmanned platforms. You need high and you need low, and you need it across all your different domains. You need it across the maritime and the air and the space and the land domains at scale at different points, because whatever you think the future is going to be, it's going to be something different. So you need wide ranges of capability across lots of different levels. And so there's absolutely, in the hybrid, there's a role for a lot of different unmanned capability, and that doesn't mean that the manned capability will suddenly go away, because as soon as you do that, the need that manned capability was fulfilling will pop back up its head and say, I need you to do this, and you just got rid of it.
Right. Yeah, so and then I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience here in a minute. So if you have questions, start thinking of those and then positioning yourself over by the microphones. But you bring up a good point here as we try to evolve towards a hybrid fleet. And we do need to bring in maybe a greater diversity of shipbuilders that maybe specialize in some of these other platforms. What's the role of foreign or allied shipbuilders? We've got Hanwha and Hyundai making investments in the United States or looking to make investments in U.S. shipyards. Obviously, Fincantieri is the owner of Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Austal USA is part of Austal in Australia. To what degree can these foreign shipbuilders and ship repair providers help out with some of these challenges? Should they focus on the new ship classes that are maybe different than what we're already building? What role can they play in trying to improve shipbuilding outcomes?
So maybe there's two layers to this, right? I think the first layer is like economically, geoeconomically, the commercial shipbuilding industry and the economics associated with it are just distorted by Chinese industrial policy, right? So the reason why China has massive over-industrial capacity in shipbuilding is because there's an industrial policy in China that says, as an export-driven economy, we're going to drive down artificially low the cost of shipping containers because it helps lift the rest of the economy. Okay. Other export-driven economies, Japanese and the Koreans in particular, had to follow suit, so their governments had to massively subsidize commercial shipbuilding in their countries to kind of keep pace. Shipbuilding left the United States because we didn't do that. Right. Not saying that was right or wrong, just the reality, right? And so it left, and you kept Jones Act in as a basic kind of parameter. Okay, so now you're in a situation that says, all right, Korean and Japanese shipyards, are you going to come to the United States and help build? The minute they do, they will absorb all the cost associated with building ships in the United States. So we should not assume that they're going to be radically more efficient because they will be dealing with all the same factors we just talked about operating here. So then I think the question then becomes, can you leverage capability that they have in their home countries, modernization, in theater support, that sort of thing, or like something right now we're doing in support of AUKUS, we're proactively qualifying Australian suppliers to then help address bottlenecks we're having in our supply chain as it relates to Virginia-class submarines. Doing that in partnership with Electric Boat to help address not only our bottlenecks, but then also help prepare the Australians for kind of their optimal pathway as they take on that capability.
Right.
And we are currently using Austal, the American side of Austal in Alabama to build structures for Virginia-class submarines and the Columbia submarine. Our objective is to get them as a focus factory. Dr. Labs mentioned this morning. They're a focus factory that we hope to get them to be able to outfit those decks, join those decks, paint those decks, outfit those decks, just like a piece of our own shipyard will be able to do. So we are currently nipping at the edges of that. I would say also that to the point that Eric made about are there capabilities, are there ideas, are there what can we mine from a more diverse playing board of shipbuilding expertise, and we certainly welcome that ability.
So one of the things that I get to do in my job that I enjoy, I do lots of things in my job that I enjoy, but I get to explain Fincantieri internationally to an American audience. And Fincantieri is a fascinating company. It's the largest shipbuilder in the world that isn't in Korea, Japan, or the People's Republic of China. And you talked about subsidizing and the building of container ships. You won't see a Fincantieri built container ship because that's not our market. We build ships that require a highly skilled, highly technical workforce to get them built. Ships where the quality and the complexity of the ship is a discriminator for the customer. And it turns out, and with all due respect to my submarine colleagues, a cruise ship might be the most complicated thing that's built on the seas today, right? I mean, it is extremely, and I've got lots of sea stories I'll tell later at the end about how complicated it is to build cruise ships. One of the things that's been benefit for us, being, having the parent company of Fincantieri, is the knowledge they've gained in welding techniques, in deck straightening, in things like panel lines, right? We get to take that, we get to use that and adapt it to the goodness of building ships for our U.S. and specifically U.S. Navy customers. The downside, right, and I was, if you're a foreign company and you're going to make a direct investment, you're going to do what Fincantieri did, because Fincantieri strategically values the U.S. market. But to do that, first you're going to get hit with CFIUS. So we're going to say, all right, we're going to have a long process to see, can you even buy into the United States? Then, if you do business with DOD, you're going to have to go through FOCI mitigation, which is why I am somewhat ridiculously titled as the CEO of Fincantieri Marinette Marine, because in any other company I would be a VP GM, right? I'm not controlled, but because of FOCI, my little yard, which is one of many, many Fincantieri yards, many of which are much bigger than me, but mine has to be separately incorporated with a separate board of directors with a certain number of the members approved by DOD so that the FOCI is mitigated, so that we function as an independent entity, although owned majority by the parent company. So we have that FOCI mitigation. Then once you actually start building a warship for the United States, I can't go talk to any of my Italian or Norwegian colleagues about the thing that I'm building, even if they gave me a parent design without an ITAR license, which is not the easiest thing to get, although I will have to credit, he's not here to credit, but Secretary Del Toro has worked to make our ability to collaborate, he's applied secretarial level pressure to make our ability to collaborate with our foreign colleagues on the programs that we're executing better and get those ITAR permissions, but it is still a lengthy and somewhat bureaucratic process. So if we want foreign knowledge and foreign investment from our allies to do this together, AUKUS is a great model. We need to take AUKUS and expand it, not just to Australia and the UK, but to other key allies and partners in the maritime space, like Italy, like Japan, like the Republic of Korea, that are trusted, and then expand the circle of what we will and won't share technologically to a standard that makes it easier to kind of fully realize the benefit of those allied partners.
Thanks, Mark. So we have time for a couple questions. So Admiral, you start.
Well, first, thank you all it's a great panel, really good discussion. I have 2 short rants and 1 question. Rant 1. So Mark, when you spoke of going through the 2,000-page ship spec for the frigate, we did that twice on the Virginia class, once for Block 1 and once for Block 3, right? And that's how we actually got the program going in the first place, because we were able to pull a tremendous amount of cost out of it. You're kind of paying the price for that on the back end, because now as we go to overhaul those ships, as they come into their first overhaul cycle, you can't get parts because all that commercial stuff we use, the supplier's out of business. There's intellectual property that we can't get back. We can't manufacture stuff in the shipyards that maybe we could have 40 years ago. So there's a real problem on the back end of that, and I'd welcome a comment at some point about, okay, how would you manage the back end of that, right? Rant number 2, and this goes back, Mark, also to your question, as part of the intellectual engineering base of the Navy as CO of Carderock. Okay, I was a chief engineer, you all know that. Let me give you some numbers, and someone needs to go fact check me, because it's probably 30 years since I've actually looked at the actual numbers. 1988, when we finished the Seawolf contract design, 1,300 seasoned engineers in NAVSEA headquarters that could make very, very good decisions, who had written the specs, who were educated and knew where to take risk and where to say, oh, this is okay, just go do this, right? Set the clock forward to 2002, that workforce went down to 265. The supporting warfare centers in 1988 had 36,000 people. In 2002, they were at 18,000, cut in half, right? Keeping that workforce educated, there was, and this is one I'm not quite sure of, but it was on the order of $100 million a year in early 1990s funds for specification development, maturation, and technology exploration, zeroed in the 1998 budget. Right, so we've worked our way back. There's about 600 people now, but it's all their first time to the rodeo. So that tech base is part of the decision-making chain that approves all of the massive amounts of paper, right? So another comment I'd like to see from you is, how do we improve the velocity of decision-making on technical approval that is stymieing an awful lot of our progress in the shipyards? Question.
We got about 2 minutes left, so.
No, this is a short question. If you could reopen your contracts, which we're all scared to death of every reopening shipbuilding contracts, what would be the first 3 things you'd add into those contracts to make this go better?
So I can take that. So if we're able to get a thing like saws in place, first thing we do is increase wages in the shipyard to address shipyard attrition, make sure we're getting the right talent in place. Second thing we'd invest in digital technologies we talked about here. Third thing we'd do is we'd invest in hard capacity.
And that's above what we're already doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Because we'd have the financial wherewithal to do that. And I say that as a company that just acquired the assets, or we announced the acquisition of the assets for W International last week. So we're already making capital investments like that, but it would enable us to do more, which we need to do.
So I don't know about reopening the contract, but I said this to the Navy in a meeting on Monday, so I'll say it here publicly. I said, the next time you do a surface ship contract, right now with the frigate, what you have is the contractor responsible for the functional design, but the government has to approve every artifact, and then we wondered after we set that up why it took way longer than originally estimated, because industry didn't have the capability that we thought we had to do the design, but then on the Navy, they were bottlenecked in bandwidth. There's lots of good people trying to do the right thing to do the due diligence, to do the approval with that reduced size workforce that you talk about. Take the time next time, I said, the next time you do a functional design, get the contractor, get the shipyard out from under it. Do it like we used to a contract design. Have the Navy get the functional design that it wants, and then tell tell the industry, tell the shipbuilder, you take the functional now and turn it into a detailed design and work packages, and you will at least take out the process time of back and forth of trying to get agreement on the functional side. Is this good enough? Is that not good enough? You'll at least go quicker that time. It may cost more. You may not quite get as much of industry efficiency because it might not be exactly how industry would do it, but you'll get the time out of it.
Eric?
2 words, workforce and technology.
Yeah, amen. Right. Someone write that down.
That's right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. And I want to thank our panelists, Mark Vandroff from Fincantieri Marinette Marine, Eric Snider from General Dynamics Electric Boat, and Eric Chewning from Huntington Ingalls Industries. So thank you, gentlemen, and we really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, I will just add my thanks to the panel. We thought it was important to get the shipbuilding industry as part of this conference and hear from them. And so we very much appreciate your insights, Mark, Eric, and Eric, and very much appreciate your great job moderating there, Bryan. So I knew you'd draw out all the important facts out of this. So this concludes Defense Forum Washington. I told you it was going to be fast and furious, and it was. Some folks I want to thank, first of all, our tremendous speakers that joined us today. You, our audience, both here in person and virtual. Our sponsor, Lockheed Martin, thank you very much for your sponsorship. And I also want to give a shout out to the IT and the audiovisual team that did a great job supporting this, so thank you for that. And also my staff at the Institute, they always do a fabulous job. They hate when I thank them, so all the more reason for me to thank them. And we hope we'll see you in future Naval Institute events in the coming year after Navy takes care of Army this weekend. So thank you again.